Hello, and welcome to Around the Political World with John Rothman. I am your host, John Rothman. If you're a fan of the show, make sure to hit the follow button on the top right of Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you are listening at this very moment. When you hit follow, leave a review or share an episode with a friend. It helps other people discover the show, keeps us going. As I like to point out each and every day, it expands our base. It is Friday, and so at the conclusion of this podcast, I will roll right into our new feature, your questions, which we will answer. So listen to the podcast and then don't go anywhere. We'll do the question and answers. There's a lot of discussion now about ICE. And you may know that a federal judge says the U.S. immigrant agents in Oregon must stop arresting people without warrants unless they are likely to escape. The ruling came in response to a lawsuit filed by a nonprofit law firm representing a man who was detained by immigration officers without a warrant, despite having a valid work visa. I point this out because I want you to understand that there are real questions now about what ICE is doing. It's coming from the left and from the right. And if you've been following the news, you know that the Senate Majority Leader, John Thune, said yesterday that demands made by Democrats for new restrictions on federal immigration officers are unrealistic, his word, unrealistic, and warned that the Department of Homeland Security will shut down next week if they do not work with Republicans and the White House. Now, you understand the argument being made by the Democrats. The Democrats say they will not vote for a Department of Homeland Security spending bill when funding runs out. Why? Because they don't like what ICE is doing. Chuck Schumer, the Democratic leader, made very clear, along with Hakeem Jeffries, the Democratic leader in the House, that an expanded federal view is very much in order. And they want to restrain President Trump from what he is doing in terms of immigration. So we have to see what happens. Schumer said that he is astounded to hear Republicans, his party's principal architects, supporting Donald Trump's efforts. So we have a real issue here that Democrats say Congress should end indiscriminate arrests. And they're right. They say we should improve warrant procedures and standards. They're right. And the upsurge that is taking place now, it is clear that federal officers cannot enter private property without a judicial warrant. And that requires that the person can be detained. So all I can tell you is this is a problem. This is also a critical matter. They want to end racial profiling. DHS officers have been stopping people because they're black or because they're Hispanic. And the simple point is that they should not be involved in anything involving spoken language, race, or ethnicity. And so the Republicans, they're not happy about this. John Barrasso from Wyoming, the number 2 Republican senator, said the demands are radical and extreme and a far left wish list. So it's a very interesting question. And you must understand that Senator Katie Britt, who is helping lead negotiations, said it was a ridiculous Christmas list of demands, and went on to say, this is not negotiating in good faith, and it's not what the American people want, said Senator Britt, who is a Republican from Alabama. They continue to play politics to their radical base at the expense of the safety of the American people. There is a clear division between Democrats and Republicans on what ICE should be doing. And it's coming down along partisan lines, pure and simple. Will the Department of Homeland Security have the funds to continue its crackdown? Donald Trump says he'll make sure they have it. Absolutely, 100%. With the Super Bowl this weekend and increased attention on what is happening in Northern California, will ICE agents be present at the games? Will, and I say games, plural, because there are all sorts of events going on here in Northern California. And will there be a response if ICE cracks down during the Super Bowl? These are real questions which need to be addressed today, now. And that's what we're trying to do. But there is more, because there's a lot of news. You know that Iran and the United States are about to hold talks in Oman. Actually, as I speak to you, they are going on right now. And the question is about Tehran's nuclear program. And will they be allowed to do anything with their nuclear program? Donald Trump has kept the pressure on Iran, moving aircraft carriers, the Abraham Lincoln, and other military assets to the Gulf. He has sent an armada, and with good reason in his mind. Now, the response of the Ayatollah, Ali Khamenei, is, we will not be intimidated. He warned that Iran would respond to any attack with an attack of its own, particularly as the theocracy, which Iran is, he commands, is upset. So what we need to understand is we have American assets in the Middle East. And that means that Iran could focus their response on those assets. I point this out because I want everyone to understand this is a very, very serious moment. If the talks fail, and we will probably know that sooner rather than later, then all bets are off. America could hit. And what are the implications? Well, if you watch the major demonstrations that are taking place in the United States and around the world, many people want the current regime in Iran overthrown. Will the United States initiate regime change? And what role will Reza Pahlavi, the Shah's son, play in that change? All of these issues are on the table. But there's more. Very important. The United States and Russia have reached an impasse. The arms treaty 50 years ago, initiated by Gerald Ford and Mr. Brezhnev, has now expired. And so for the first time in more than, 50 years, we don't have an arms agreement with the Russians. So what is happening is this. Two countries, since President Trump returned to office, have had impasse after impasse. But the question of a nuclear arms agreement, something that would hold, is a real question. So what have the United States and Russia done? They have restored communications, and they say this action will provide a consistent military-to-military contact as the parties continue to work together towards what they call a lasting peace. The U.S. European Command made that statement, but the agreement emerges only after a meeting between senior Russian and American military officials in Oman. This is a critical moment. Moscow escalated its attack on Ukraine's power grid. Here we are in the middle of winter. And more than that, the tensions between the United States and Russia continue to grow. Remember that what we want is Russia out, but there is a 600-mile front line going right through eastern and southern parts of Ukraine. Let me explain that the resumption of the military hotline marks an effort to ease tensions that soared and which are still soaring. I don't know whether or not this can be averted, a major catastrophe between the United States and Russia, in part because Russian policy is determined by one man, Vladimir Putin, and Well, the simple truth is that Putin is not a rational player. How far will Putin push the envelope? And the other question is, how far will Donald Trump go? Our allies are very concerned. There's no question about it. And you understand that we now have constant issues with the Russians over drones in the Black Sea, Russian fighter planes over Poland, and Moscow has denied that its warplanes are involved in all of this, but there is no doubt it's the only power that could have that kind of impact. So, one of the things we are looking for now is the escalation of military tension, and that involves Russia and the United States. It involves Poland, which I would remind you is a member of NATO, which means that if Article 5 were invoked, well, it would be a serious problem because remember, you defend one if anyone is attacked. So this is a complex, very difficult moment. And there is a critical aspect of all of this when you have a president of the United States who makes statements, and you've got Putin who also makes statements, and the two of them don't seem to be able to agree on anything. Interestingly enough, Donald Trump said last week that Vladimir Putin had agreed to cease these aggressive hostilities with drones in Kiev. And of course, that hasn't happened. The drones continue to fly over Ukraine, and the ability to come to some sort of an agreement seems further away. This is a far cry from when the President of the United States said, "Elect me to office and I will solve the problem in one day." Remember that? So we are watching now all of these questions. And this, to me, is the most serious. Why? Because Richard Nixon once observed that 70% of a president's time is engaged in foreign policy. Yet we know that the Trump administration, with all its efforts and all its bluff and bluster, has not delivered in any way, shape, or form on a reduction in hostilities in Ukraine. Certainly, the question of Iran hangs heavy, and Eastern Europe is very insecure. Let me point out that the president continues to undermine NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And when you have states like Poland involved directly, when you have additional problems in terms of other states surrounding Russia, then, my friends, we know there is a problem. This is a moment in history. And the question is Marco Rubio, who is National Security Advisor to the President and Secretary of State, able to do the kinds of negotiations that he needs to do? And what about Steve Witkoff? And what about Jared Kushner? They are involved in negotiations, both dealing with Iran and dealing with Ukraine. And so far, frankly, I don't see much progress. Although the argument can be made we're not in a war, maybe that's a good thing. So we are watching carefully what will happen in the next few days. I know we have a weekend coming up, and it's a difficult time, frankly, for a weekend, because news is breaking constantly. And so I just want all of you to be aware that foreign policy remains critical, tantamount, important. And what happens in the next few days will be critical to the Trump administration and to the world. So keep your eye on Oman. Keep your eye on what negotiators come up with about Iran. Keep your eyes open when it comes to Ukraine. And I know we have a lot of news, a lot of information, but this to me is the critical moment. So we will see in the days ahead. And on Monday, when we're back, we'll have a better idea of precisely whether any of these negotiations are working. Now, you may know that we decided to do an additional 15 minutes right here on Around the Political World with John Rothman. and that they would be listener-directed questions. Gogo Zoger, the wonderful producer of this program, has listed 5 questions which you have asked, which I have been asked to answer. This comes from Mitch556. The question relates to Don Lemon's arrest. So we're just supposed to ignore the video of him committing all of his crimes? I've watched the video. I don't see crimes. But I can tell you that Nancy Pelosi made a statement just yesterday dealing with the arrest of Don Lemon and the implications for the complete one-third layoff at the Washington Post. Her observation was clear. Freedom of speech, freedom of the press, having this aspect is critical. And so I would suggest to you, Mitch, that Don Lemon's arrest is an intrusion on our right to free speech. If a reporter can be arrested and silenced for doing their job, it's a problem. Now, you do raise a question. Did Don Lemon commit any crimes? I haven't seen them yet. I've looked at the indictment. I don't see crimes. What I see is a federal government going after a news person who is critical of the Trump administration. Tell me if I'm wrong, but I don't think so. Question number 2 from Waystop4. Wow, very good observations on Trump's rambling discourse. Where were the critics during the last presidency of Joe Biden? Well, let me begin with a rambling discourse. Did you listen to the president yesterday at the prayer breakfast in Washington, D.C.? He didn't address matters relating to prayer. No, not at all. He gave his standard speech about how the election was stolen, all of the usual sorts of things. Were we critical of Joe Biden? You bet. But Joe Biden never committed these kinds of rhetorical excesses, nor did Joe Biden challenge the very constitutional basis of the First Amendment. I say this to you respectfully. It is not that Joe Biden was the perfect president. But when you compare Biden and Trump, let me tell you, we didn't have those rambling discourses filled with distortions and untruths like we have from Donald Trump. And this comes from Cat Lover X8 on Trump's enacting the Insurrection Act. It's been done before. Don't act like it hasn't. Remember George Wallace trying to prevent integration in his state? You learn some history, idiot. I've discussed this question. And of course, when the Insurrection Act was imposed during the tensions over desegregation, there was good reason. The state of Alabama was in defiance of federal law and judges. And of course, what use is the Insurrection Act when there is no insurrection? There is no insurrection going on in this country now, but I can tell you that when there was an insurrection on January 6th, Donald Trump, who was the president of the United States, not only instigated it, but did nothing to prevent it, and then has gone on to pardon many of those who attacked members of the police force. This, to me, is another question that we must all face. What Donald Trump is doing is lawlessness, pure and simple. And although the Insurrection Act was used during the civil rights struggle, and I can remember when it was imposed in Washington, D.C. after the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., because I was there, this supposed use of the Insurrection Act by this president, particularly affecting elections, if he were to do so, would be a shocking demonstration of abuse of power. KJ Denton on Don Lemon said, Guy is not in the press anymore. He is an activist. Let me answer your question very directly. Don Lemon is in the press. The press is not what it used to be. The press was once upon a time when you worked for a network. and when you had press credentials. Today, we don't have that kind of network journalism. And certainly, if you take a look at what's happening in the Washington Post, we have less and less journalist authenticity from conventional media. Now we have people like me. I was with KGO 810 AM in San Francisco for years, and I had a press credential. Now, all I have is my podcast, which means that you may suggest to me, KJ Denton, that I'm not a legitimate news person. I reject that. News has changed, and who is credentialed and who isn't, and how things are covered, depends very much on what we do. I want to remind you that the right-wing media, Donald Trump's media, equally has been empowered by being given press credentials at the White House, but they aren't conventional media. The Associated Press has been banned from the White House. So I think it's purely a matter of determining, is someone a legitimate person covering a story, left or right? And the answer, I believe, is there has to be more license for this, and a recognition that Don Lemon is and was a legitimate news person. I would, by the way, feel just as strongly if Sean Hannity or Mark Levin were restricted. I think the idea of a free press means just that. Jonathan also asks a question about Don Lemon. He's not a journalist anymore. Come on, man. So what are you going to say to me? And I ask this respectfully, Jonathan. I'm no longer on KGO radio. I no longer have that cover, if you will, of being legitimate press. I am a podcaster who you listen to. And I want to say very clearly, we better start redefining what we mean about press. Donald Trump has certainly done it. I just mentioned the fact that Donald Trump removed the Associated Press from permission to cover things in the White House. And we have seen press restrictions at the Department of Defense. You now know that to cover the Department of Defense, Pete Hegseth has imposed a rule. And the rule is that you have to conform to their method of press coverage. Free thinking is not encouraged by this administration. So many of you have raised this question about freedom of speech, and I'm glad you did, because in answering this question, let me also assure you that Speaker Emerita Nancy Pelosi condemned massive Washington Post layoffs just yesterday. She also condemned the arrest of journalist Don Lemon and other recent actions that Pelosi believes are eroding fundamental press freedoms. And I believe she's right. We cannot have these kinds of restrictions. And this is how Nancy Pelosi said it. We see efforts to intimidate journalists, to discredit legitimate reporting, and to replace evidence with conspiracy. This is not accidental. It is strategic, because those who fear transparency and accountability fear the press. It's an important point. And where did Nancy Pelosi make these statements? An evening at the Washington Press Club Foundation's congressional dinner. And I have to say to you, she's right. She said, when corporate interests gut local, national, and international journalism, communities lose watchdogs, truth loses megaphones, and democracy loses guardians. This is important. And because several of you today have asked about Don Lemon, let me remind you that Lemon is a former CNN anchor. He was arrested for his alleged connection to a church demonstration in St. Paul, Minnesota, where a simple matter was being covered. Lemon said he was at the Minnesota church to document the podcast, and let me tell you something, that's his job. I do the same thing. I have covered events without being part of the conventional media. And Nancy Pelosi is raising these points because they're important. Pelosi didn't put the threat to journalists solely on the shoulders of Donald Trump and the current administration. She pointed out, as I did yesterday in my broader podcast, that post cuts are part of a broader reprehensible pattern of corporate leaders following their lead, the Trump administration's lead, hollowing out newsrooms and leaving communities without watchdogs. And this is what Pelosi said: because democracy does die in darkness. That's right. It does die in darkness. This is a critical moment in terms of all of your question and answers, because almost all of them have focused on this question. I would be remiss if I did not point out that there are many issues which need to be addressed, including foreign policy questions, which we addressed in the podcast before these question and answers. But I'm happy to take your question and answers, and I want to thank Gogo Zoger, who once again has given us the benefit of organizing it all. Now, let me remind you that we do this every Friday, that you can pose any questions you want, and I'm happy to try to answer them directly. I had an incident happen this week where a woman was very upset with me because she said, "John, is there nothing that Trump does that you can agree with?" Well, there are things that Trump has done that deserve commendation, but there are things that Trump has done that deserve condemnation. And I think the question of a free press makes those issues all the more vital. Thanks for tuning into another episode of Around the Political World, and especially thank you for all the questions you have posed. I hope I've answered them directly, and I encourage you to submit more questions. Gogo is reviewing them, and we'll be happy to deal with them every Friday. And of course, I'd love to hear your thoughts on today's episode and today's question and answers. You can write a review on Apple Podcasts, drop a comment on YouTube or Spotify, and you can also click any of the links to the show notes to connect with me on social media. That's how we get your questions. Please remember to share this episode with a friend or colleague so we can continue to grow and expand. Believe me, that's what we want to do. And of course, this show has been getting such positive attention that we now have advertising support. And that, of course, is a great pleasure. I am John Rothman, and I've given you commentary, I've given you question and answers, and we shall continue to do this. In the meantime, stay tuned for next week. No doubt, the world will be in a very different place, and we will be right there covering it on Around the Political World with John Rothman. Thanks again to Gogo and to all of you. See you on Monday.
If you like the show, please take a moment to rate, review, and subscribe. It really does help the show to grow. Thank you for listening.